Hello, and welcome to this EHS Today webinar, Workplace Violence, Strategies for Prevention and Response, sponsored by AlertMedia. I'm Nicole Stempak, Managing Editor of EHS Today. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Katie Gowen, Director of Content and Communications for AlertMedia. Welcome, Katie. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Katie Gowen. I'll be your moderator today. And I really appreciate all of you joining today's discussion about workplace violence. I know it's not a pleasant topic, but unfortunately, it is a relevant one. So lucky for us, our guests are very knowledgeable about this topic, and they have some suggested strategies for prevention and response that you can incorporate into your plans. So speaking of today's guests, I'd love to introduce you to them. Matthew Doherty is nationally recognized for his work in violence prevention and threat assessment. As Managing Director of the Sikich Workforce Risk Management Team, Matt brings extensive experience from 5 decades of service helping organizations build and expand violence prevention programs, assess and manage violence risks, train and empower workforces, and gain the business benefits that come with safe and supportive workplaces. He retired from a 21-year career with the United States Secret Service as the special agent in charge of the National Threat Assessment Center. So he's kind of a big deal. Hi, Matt. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to have this operationally relevant relationship with AlertMedia as we navigate ourselves through this difficult topic.
Absolutely. Well, we certainly feel the same. And I'd also like to welcome Peter Steinfeld. He is the Senior Vice President of Safety Solutions at AlertMedia, and he's also the host of the Employee Safety Podcast, where he interviews safety, security, business continuity, and disaster recovery experts. And actually, Matt was a guest on the podcast last fall. So if you like today's discussion and topic, you'll definitely want to check that out. But back to Peter. Peter has more than 20 years of experience advising organizations of all sizes on emergency communication and employee safety matters. Hi, Peter. It's great to have you here today.
Excellent to be here. And I'm looking forward to the webinar today. Super happy to have Matt here. He's got tremendous amounts of knowledge and wisdom. And I do recommend that after this webinar is over, if you like what you hear, definitely go listen to that episode. It was fantastic.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both again for taking the time. I do want to go ahead and go over today's agenda. First, we're going to discuss the growing threat of workplace violence according to some recent data. We'll talk about how to develop a holistic workplace violence prevention program. And then, of course, best practices for building a response plan. So as Nicole said, there will be some questions at the end, but feel free to use that Q&A box at any time to submit them. And they don't have to be traditional questions. If any of you have a comment or a piece of advice or anything relevant at all to the conversation, you're welcome to drop it in there. So I'd like to get started with a poll, and you're going to see a few polls come up throughout the presentation today. So I really would encourage you all to participate in them. It really gives us some extra context on, why you're here and what you're looking for. So here's the first question that we have, which is, how would you describe your organization's current workplace violence prevention program? Would you say we have a robust plan in place? Maybe you have a plan in place, but it could use some improvement. Maybe you're in the process of building out your plan now, or maybe you don't have a plan in place right now. So I'm going to give that just another couple seconds if you could all get your answers in, because I do want to go ahead and share them with Matt and Peter so we can get their feedback. So let's go ahead and share those results now. Okay. Looks like the majority of the folks are saying the second answer, which is we have a plan in place that could use improvement. But I do want to point out that all of the answers are represented here. So clearly we have kind of a broad perspective of folks on the call today. So let me go to you, Matt. What are your thoughts here?
I think it's wonderful that people acknowledge that they do have a plan and there's always room for improvement. That concept should never stop. It's like an emergency management plan that many of you are familiar with. it just can't sit on a shelf. It has to be constantly improved. There are ongoing issues. For instance, there's issues being addressed right now, post-pandemic, that were not issues just a few years ago. For instance, a hybrid workforce, remote workforce. So it's just not surprising to me. I'm just glad that people are acknowledging, even if they do have a plan, that there's need for improvement. And hopefully that need for improvement will be further recognized during this discussion.
Sure. All right, Peter, did you have anything to add to that?
Nothing to add. That was well said.
Wonderful. All right. Well, I'm going to keep things moving here. I'm going to turn it over to Peter now, who will discuss, just how to set the stage with some data, some definitions, and get us all aligned. Peter, over to you.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Katie. I appreciate it. All right, let's go ahead and get started with some clear definitions. A natural assumption is that workplace violence means something like a physical attack or an active shooter incident, but it's actually much more than that. If an act creates any kind of risk to the physical and or emotional health and safety of an employee in the workplace, then it can be considered a form of workplace violence. Now, these incidents may occur inside or outside the office, like in parking lots or at a company happy hour and in remote work sites and locations. OSHA actually officially defines workplace violence as any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or some kind of other threatening behavior that occurs at the work site. And the four most commonly occurring types of workplace violence, according to the National Institute for Occupational Health and Safety, also known by the acronym NIOSH, are first, criminal intent by an unaffiliated party, such as robbery or trespassing. Second is customer or client aggression toward a place of business or its employees. Next is worker-on-worker violence, including issues between coworkers or contractors. And then last is personal relationship related. And there's a lot of those types of things that go on. For example, a partner or an ex-partner or a family member of an employee. We should also clarify that workplace violence incidents may include acts of domestic violence and potentially suicide, but not lawful acts of self-defense or the defense of others. Now, the workplace violence data, unfortunately, speaks for itself. In the US alone, there are about, unfortunately, 2 million victims of workplace violence each year. There's also a lack of preparedness at quite a few organizations. Over 60% of companies out there do not currently conduct active shooter preparedness drills. And half of organizations report having experienced at least one incident of workplace violence. So when you have so many victims each year and roughly 50% of organizations reporting that they've already experienced an incident, I think it goes without saying that workplace violence prevention should be a top priority for every business out there. And employees are concerned about workplace violence as well. According to the 2024 State of Employee Safety Report, it was nearly 1 in 4 US employees have experienced some kind of workplace violence at some point in their careers. And more than a third of them report being concerned about it. They're not just shrugging it off. And that's because it's really difficult for people to be productive if they're fearful while they're working. The safer they feel, the greater the potential for productivity across the organization. And as you'll see here, some industries experience acts of workplace violence a whole lot more than others. This graph from the National Safety Council lists the top 3 occupations currently experiencing the most workplace assaults. So very obviously, protective service occupations, that makes total sense, but then transportation and material moving, as well as food service and preparation. But look at which occupations are really close behind that: maintenance, construction, and healthcare. And I know a number of today's attendees work in those areas, so I just wanted to make sure to mention it. Ultimately, I think that's what this speaks to, is that no industries or occupations are immune from the risk of workplace violence. And then lastly, before I turn things over to Matt, organizations shouldn't overlook the financial risks associated with acts of workplace violence. The average out-of-court settlement for a single incident is about $500,000. And then for workplace violence incidents that eventually go to trial, the typical jury award is exponentially higher at about $3 million. Then there's the revenue loss. Businesses in the US lose about an average of $250 to $330 billion a year due to workplace violence incidents. That's a lot of money. So I think what we're getting at here, just to start things off, is that acts of violence in the workplace are traumatic, they can be highly disruptive, very expensive, and in many cases, life-altering for those who experience them. But with a comprehensive workplace violence prevention and response plan in place, you can act quickly and effectively to mitigate any harm and then maintain business operations, which is what it's all about, mitigating that harm and maintaining operations. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Matt now because he has more details and strategies on how to develop those plans. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Let's just jump right into this. How do we develop those plans to make sure that you have a fully integrated workplace violence prevention program within your operations? Well, the first step was recommended by ASIS, which is the Security Directors Standards Association that many of us are familiar with. And also they partnered with the Society of Human Resource Management in 2011. And they recommended, along with many others, such as the FBI, Secret Service, OSHA, to conduct a workplace violence needs assessment. And what that entails is getting all of those policies that are possibly related within a company or public or private sector and interviewing key stakeholders, such as your director of HR, regional directors, security, legal, facilities. And a little anecdote, we also include in that needs assessment executive assistants, receptionists, and office managers. Oftentimes our clients will ask, well, why are you interviewing receptionists, office managers, and executive assistants? They're not decision makers on policies. And our reply is, and I think many of you would agree, nobody knows the interpersonal dynamics of an office better than those positions. What is most affecting the C-suite? The executives might not be aware of issues that are at that level. So we look for the face of the company employees to conduct that needs assessment. And you want to start creating your own policies that are focused on prevention. And we'll talk about zero tolerance, but really prevention is the key here. Don't wait for an incident to occur, for any of these incidents to occur, because what we find is, and you can even look at social media accounts and media outlets, when an incident occurs, usually the behavior concerned others, and unfortunately they escalated on a pathway to a workplace violence incident. So, as I said, as we're going through these policies, I'll talk about zero tolerance for this. Most guidelines, we're getting away from zero tolerance. I'm fairly confident that if your company or government agency has a fight or overt sexual harassment occurred, that will be reported. But untreated mental health, somebody that's a victim of domestic abuse, those warning signs, we're getting away from the punitive approach. It's amazing to me, having done this for the last 15 years in the private sector, when we do get these handbooks and all the documents to do the needs assessment, oftentimes we'll get a one-sentence epiphany about workplace violence, that workplace violence won't be tolerated, as if that's a preventive program. And it really interferes with reporting, and it's really an inflexible approach and has a punitive tone where people don't want to get involved. You want to have a more progressive approach of zero tolerance for incidents, which focuses on eliminating at-risk behaviors before an incident occurred. Workplace violence won't be tolerated is not a policy. And as we get into policies, we firmly believe that workplace violence policies are the responsibility of leadership to enact it from the top down. The program is the responsibility of everyone in the organization. I'd like to address protective and restraining orders. Now, when you hear from the Department of Labor that 40% of women killed in the workplace are killed by an intimate partner, that's almost an epidemic proportions. And I don't want to imply that men are not immune from being a victim of domestic abuse, but for all practical purposes, women are really vulnerable and in danger in the workforce when you hear that. Domestic violence is clearly a major life stressor, and it's so important to identify warning signs and to encouraging reporting. One of the best practices, and we'll talk about it later in a case study, is to become aware of protective or restraining orders. And there is a difference between the two. For instance, in Texas, a restraining order is merely a citation if the perpetrator shows up at the workplace. A protective order requires an arrest. So you have to be familiar with that. Perhaps protective orders could be expanded to cover the company. And back to that zero tolerance, you have to make people comfortable realizing it has nothing to do with their professional performance, but make them feel comfortable enough to confidentially go to HR with a protective order. It's very important to recognize warning signs and concerning behaviors. You know, when you witness that fight, as I said, on a zero tolerance policy, it's almost too late. The incidents occurred. But the warning signs, they could be physical, emotional, behavioral. It's just very important, and consider non-punitive and anonymous reporting systems. Some of us, for instance, might not be comfortable reporting our boss. We're worried that they're suffering from anger management issues, some untreated mental health issues, and that really minimizes that fear of retaliation. Nothing can destroy a successful workplace violence prevention program more than people feel like it's a punitive program and there'll be retaliation if I report a concern, and it's almost like a whistleblower, right? You want to report that concerning behavior, and it's very important to really respect anybody that reports in good faith a concerning situation in the workplace, no matter how trivial it may seem initially. It's really important to collaborate with law enforcement. It wasn't too long ago where law enforcement, if I called them, and we have on our staff here at Sikich at Workforce Risk Management, social media analysis, we have clinical psychologists that do violent risk assessments. But just a few years ago, if I called law enforcement and said, I have concerning behaviors, I have a threat management team here, we're looking at a case, law enforcement's typical response would be, a crime hasn't been committed, call us later. It reminds me of stalking laws in women in the 70s. What would happen until the first stalking laws were enacted in the 70s? A woman would approach police departments and say, I'm being stalked, what can I do? And their reply was, sorry, unless a crime's been committed, there's nothing we can do. And we all know that had tragic consequences. Well, the same goes with law enforcement. They now have been instructed from organizations such as the Fraternal Order of Police, the Police Executive Research Forum. If you are called by a company with concerning behaviors, invite them to participate in that discussion if it's warranted, a case-by-case basis. They may be well aware of this person in the community, as Peter classified that, whether it be a customer, whether it be a family member, a contractor, visitor, or frankly, a criminal intent right off the street, unknown to the company. But they are ready, willing, and able to participate in this. Each police department is different, of course, but really collaborate with law enforcement on these efforts. And it's very important to emphasize early interventions. That's the key. Early warning signs, where we call it the pathway to violence. If somebody's exhibiting anger management issues or bullying is somewhat accepted in a company culture, that's what leads to an escalation. And potentially, nobody can predict violence, but it's really about prevention. How can we get that person the assistance they need, whether it be employee assistance, recognizing that there might be a danger from those categories that Peter talked about. So the best prevention is really developing those programs and addressing those types of situations. So workplace violence interrupted, as an example. Recently, we had a person that was being terminated, and it was a very concerning termination. The person had anger management issues, and we were called by a major manufacturer, pretty prominent in certain regions in the country, and he had anger management issues, and they wanted us to provide protective services. This was a call on a Tuesday, and they wanted to fire somebody on Friday for anger management issues. What we did was, the first question I asked was, always be aware when a client is in a hurry to fire somebody. I asked some questions. Why is he being fired? He has anger management issues. Well, what's causing this? And they said, well, we don't know, but we heard he's bipolar. And that's appalling to us. We had never dealt with this client before. Does the American Disabilities Act mean anything to you? Apparently, he was a 10-year employee, and these behaviors were being exhibited just within the last few weeks. But nonetheless, we designed a severance package for that person and wanted to extend some benefits for him. And lo and behold, we did a surveillance on this person out of an abundance of caution. And when he was fired, we had a surveillance person follow him 90 minutes later to the gun store. And with his own license, he was purchasing weapons. Now, think about this. Is it illegal to be bipolar when we all should recognize that the vast majority of people suffering from mental health issues are law-abiding citizens? We all have a friend, family, loved one that perhaps is dealing with those issues. Is it against the law to be fired? No. And is it against the law to walk in with your own license in that particular state and purchase weapons on the spot? No. But obviously, we had what's known as a pathway to violence. So we started looking for that person. There was a list of people he didn't like at his desk, and we had to provide protection for them. We cost them a lot of money. And what we wanted to do is to get everybody in a good place. So we called his wife, and she said she loved him very much. They have a 12-year-old son. Why didn't they let me know? I didn't know if he was also his medications. So we were able, with our clinical psychologist, to get assistance with the courts, to get his wife to sign a court-ordered mental health treatment so that we could legally get the weapons taken away. We had him a court-ordered mental health treatment for a 72-hour evaluation. He couldn't return to work, and it was a successful story, and it was interrupted, but it cost the company a lot of expenses on liability issues and reputational issues. It made the national media, et cetera, and they just didn't have a program in place.
Wow. It's an incredible story, Matt. Thank you so much for sharing that. I do want to go ahead and launch our next poll now. This time we're asking all of you, which policy or procedure resonated with you the most? Like Matt mentioned, maybe it's addressing protective and restraining orders, perhaps recognizing the warning signs and those concerning behaviors that he talked about, developing a reporting system for concerning behaviors, collaborating with law enforcement, or maybe it's emphasizing those early interventions. So let me give this one just another moment or two, if you could get your answers in. And then let's go ahead and share these, please. Okay, it looks like most folks are saying recognizing warning signs and concerning behaviors. But again, just like our first poll, all of the answers are represented here. So Matt, what are your thoughts there?
Spot on with the recognizing warning signs and behaviors. Our licensed clinical psychologists who have been thoroughly trained in violent risk assessments to assist companies. There's a technical term they use, and it's called the creepy radar. If something's not right with a coworker or a visitor, customer, again, all those categories that Peter named, if you feel that something's not right, if you sense something, then say something. So I'm glad that people are recognizing these warning signs. Not all of them will escalate to an act of workplace violence, but that's where acts of workplace violence usually start, in that concerning behaviors, that we have to get our arms around that and make sure that we're doing everything possible to manage those situations.
Absolutely. Peter, any additional thoughts?
I think it is spot on that if you can recognize something early, you can nip it in the bud. That's like the ultimate job of law enforcement, is to try to identify these things before they happen, and organizations too. If you can see when there's something that's going to go off the rails and stop ahead of time, it's going to be a much better outcome. But Matt, I have a question for you. You did allude to this earlier, that it's oftentimes difficult for people to come forward and actively notice things and then actively say something about it. See something, say something. What's a good way for an organization to do that, to encourage people? I know you mentioned a few things, but like, what have you seen being really effective in organizations that made people say, yeah, I feel completely comfortable saying something?
Well, absolutely. To recognize that mental health, for instance, is an issue that we all have friends, family, loved ones, that it's not a punitive program. That's why the policies after that needs assessment is, as you develop the program, again, it's the responsibility of every employee to emphasize to them. And I think a good example is domestic violence. We'll have a case study in a few minutes here, but it's against most state labor laws to discriminate against someone merely because they're a victim of domestic abuse. And why that's so important is maybe 15, 20, 25 years ago in some states, if a woman showed up with a black eye, for instance, there might be some cultural ignorance, frankly, at that time not to promote that person. Well, that's illegal in most states. They are entitled, victims of domestic abuse are entitled. It's got nothing to do with their professional performance. And when you emphasize that in your policies and your programs, you will see an increase in the reporting. And again, that's why we always emphasize, even if you just have a compliance hotline, let's leverage that and make that an anonymous reporting hotline. Some people may not be comfortable reporting their boss for having concerning behavior, understandably so. Or if the classic office bully, which definitely should be not occurring in a company culture of courtesy, respect, and safety. You know, those types of things, an anonymous reporting line can really be leveraged as well.
Good question, Peter. Thanks for calling that out. All right, Matt, we're going to go back to you now. What's step two?
Well, step two is developing a training program. And this isn't just a training program that, you know, like cyber training where you change your password and you get that reminder. We've all had to sit through that every year, right? If not more. But really, 3 principal audiences with a distinct curriculum. The entire workforce has to be educated. Now, it can be done via e-learning. It can be a 30-minute virtual lecture. It can be done in person. But really, what are the foundational principles? What are the warning signs and concerning behaviors? And active assailant response is critically important. That security awareness, if there is an incident, you know, for instance, what to expect when police arrive on the scene, security awareness in advance of where your office is, or if you're a field worker, all of those things. So the entire workforce should be educated about that. It can be less than 30 minutes, but it is comforting to know for your employees, wow, the leadership is really thinking about this, and it's not teaching defensive tactics, for instance. It's really about prevention and the new policies. Managers, guess what? Once you educate the workforce on these warning signs and behaviors, managers are going to start getting reports. Managers have been trained on what to observe. So how do you manage difficult situations? And also de-escalation and conflict resolution. Unfortunately, and I'm sure there's an experience in this audience, that sometimes managers' handling of certain situations can inadvertently, although well-intended, escalate a certain situation, poking the bear, if you will. So teaching de-escalation, how do you manage a conflict resolution when you see coworkers, contractors, visitors exhibiting those types of behaviors? Last but not least, the threat management team. It's recommended by OSHA, as is the Society of Human Resource Management, interdisciplinary teams. Everyone has their day job. Some of the larger companies that we deal with have full-time management teams. Others, you know, it's other duties as assigned, but it's really HR, legal, facilities, ad hoc members being trained. Okay, now that you have this case, how are we going to manage this case with this? So those creation of threat management teams, it's more nuanced training, interactive training, scenario-based training, et cetera. But it's really, and how to do that violent risk screening, and oftentimes requires the use of a licensed clinical psychologist. There are some new laws that have been developed. We've been very busy with California. Many people in the audience have probably heard about Senate Bill 553. It really started with a San Jose shooting, and to a credit of a state senator, made it his mission in life because 10 people were killed in a transit authority location by an employee who concerned others, had all the warning signs, had never been trained. Managers had not been trained. They didn't know who to report it to. So you can imagine the lawsuits that followed, and more importantly, the loved ones that were lost, and the tragedy, knowing that that prime suspect of who committed that shooting was a concern to others, and nothing was done about it. So California required anybody with 10 or more employees to have a workplace violence prevention plan, which includes training, which includes record keeping. We've been very busy with that. Senate Bill 240 in Texas regarding healthcare workers. The Texas Nurses Association has coined the phrase, this is the bill where it's don't mess with Texas nurses. But nurses, at one point, by statistical analysis, they are 4 times as likely than any other profession to experience some type of violence during the course of their career. And that's just astounding for that. There's Senate bill in New York dedicated towards resale. And it's kind of not surprising for many of you as you watch the media. Grocery assaults from 2018 to 2020 have increased by 63%. So New York is recognizing this. Convenience stores, during the same time period, violence increased towards retail workers and convenience stores by 75%. So they're getting it now. You're going to see in the not too distant future, probably federal OSHA and other states following suit. It did not surprise us. All of these bills have been enacted. California, we get questions from clients. If we have 10 or more employees in San Francisco, but we have 10,000 in Chicago, should we spread it out to Chicago as well? And our answer is, even though it's not a legal requirement to do so, we think you should, because those are the best standards. And guess what? It's coming to a theater near you. These states are starting to pass this, especially after an incident, unfortunately, but you're starting to see a trend across the country. And we're thrilled to see it, because up until now, those as-is and SHRM guidelines that I talked about were just that, standards and guidelines. Now it's a legal requirement with penalties, fines, and reputational damage involved. So develop trust through training. I want to talk about how that training really encourages that reporting. Just recently, I was training an insurance company, about 1,000 employees. It was in person. The CEO introduced the program. We had done the needs assessment. We had put together the policies and programs, and we announced about protective orders. If you have a protective order, it is a best practice. Please report it to HR and security. And the first thing we did was we reminded them in that particular state, you cannot discriminate against someone merely because they're a victim of domestic abuse. It has nothing to do with your professional performance. But again, when you hear that 40% of women killed in the workplace are killed by an intimate partner, it's just really a test tube for those violent occurrences. So we briefed them. We encouraged them to come forward. And during the break, an office manager escorted a young woman. Remember what I said about office managers? They kind of know the interpersonal dynamics. She approached me. She was in her late 20s, well-regarded 5-year employee. And I knew right away she has a restraining order. She was very distraught. And I said, how can I help you? And she says, I have a restraining order. And I said, what's the circumstances? Who's the person? She said, I went on a blind date, and it's the worst mistake I ever made in my life. And I live with my brother and his wife. My parents are too old to live with. She was in another county. And the CEO could see me in the back of the room. We were able to expand that restraining order to the workplace. We got a picture of the person. We liaisoned with law enforcement in the area of the work, because she lived in the next county over. And any law enforcement person will tell you, court ordered mental health treatments and restraining orders, domestic violence, law enforcement still has a long way to go. They do not typically share that information across jurisdictional lines on databases. So we made sure the local police was aware of it. That person was arrested for other bad things. We also escorted her. We had the security guard, without knowing her personal business, escort her to and from a specially designated parking space. Well, that person was arrested for other bad things. And the CEO called me a couple weeks after, and he says, Matt, that was a well-regarded employee. And I can't help but think that other young people of her demographic, in other words, other young women, knew about this, but didn't want to, quote unquote, get her in trouble, didn't want to negatively impact her career, all of those things that a successful program will eliminate, and caused her to come forward. I'm very happy to say, and always proud to say, that just a few months ago, she was promoted within the organization. And we respected her privacy. When we got a picture of the person and made sure that that person was a do not admit, and the escorts from security, no one needed to know the circumstances. That was a very violent person. And I always say that could happen to anyone. And that has no bearing on her career. And frankly, she didn't want to come forward because she didn't want people to judge her as a bad person or lacking judgment and common sense. That wasn't the case. It could have happened to anybody. So it's really a successful story when you develop that trust through training.
Another great story, Matt. Thank you so much. I think we're going to pause now for another quick audience poll. This time we're asking everyone, what does workplace violence training look like at your organization currently? So perhaps you offer training in both prevention and response. Maybe the training is prevention only. Maybe it's response only. Or maybe you don't offer any workplace violence training currently. So just like before, let's get those answers in. Looks like we have quite a few coming in here, which is great. All right, let's go ahead and share those results so I can chat with Matt and Peter about them. Okay, so answer 1 and 4 are kind of neck and neck here. So that's training in both prevention and response. And then, we don't offer any training currently. So it looks like we're all over the board here. What are your thoughts there, Matt?
Well, one of the trends I see as far as training, some of our potential clients and folks that we've talked to, you have a workplace violence prevention training, and sometimes people confuse that with active shooter training. That's when the incident's already occurred, and we do that ourselves. Active assailant training, what to expect when the police arrive on the scene, security awareness, how do you run, hide, or fight, those types of things. But sometimes there's a confluence, if you will, or a confusion on what workplace violence prevention training means and how to get those warning signs and behaviors. I'm sure there are many in the audience here who are going to look at their employee handbook and see those magic words. Workplace violence won't be tolerated. Fights won't be tolerated. Sexual harassment won't be tolerated. Well, of course, but that's not an epiphany for workplace violence prevention. What are the warning signs? How do we report? Those types of things. So bravo to those people that do have prevention training, but let's really elevate everyone's game here to really have a true workplace violence prevention policy and program that's trained on.
Absolutely. And since we've been talking, the numbers have skewed just a little bit. Now we have 47% of folks answering number 1, which is both types of training. So that is interesting to see the numbers change as we move on. Peter, I'm going to skip your thoughts here just so we can move on to the response plan, which is our next section. So I'm going to hand it over to you now to talk about that.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Katie. So first, you're going to want to identify your business's most likely and impactful workplace violence vulnerabilities or just potential threats that you can think of, so you know how to prioritize response planning for different types of emergencies. For example, if your employees work directly with customers, they may be more likely to encounter customer and client violence than anything else. For each identified threat, you then want to choose an appropriate response that adequately addresses the risks. You definitely don't want to treat everyone the same. Front office workers are going to be different from back office workers. People that work in warehouses, different than people that work behind a computer all day. So just keep those things in mind. Now, some workplace violence threats may require multiple types of response plans. A threat with criminal intent, such as a nearby active shooter event, may involve planning for both evacuation and shelter in place. So several things you got to think about. A customer threat, such as aggression or assault, might call for both de-escalation and protective legal action responses. Again, multiple things to consider, different from the former example. Really thorough and effective vulnerability assessments consider all these things and then give you all sorts of findings on which to base the proper response plan. Also very helpful and important is taking time to review any past incidents for insights and context about what has worked or not worked in your past incidents that you experienced in workplace violence. Hopefully, you conducted after-action reviews and then created after-action reports for all those past incidents that are now available for reference. They can be a rich source of information to help others that are newer to the organization understand what to do. If you're not doing those things, I highly recommend it. And if you need more information on the after-action process, absolutely feel free to get in touch with me, reach out after today's webinar, and I can provide you with additional details and suggestions. Now, another extremely important aspect of this overall process is communication, and that's near and dear to my heart. Workplace violence incidents require very immediate and careful communication to protect employees and sensitive information around it. So take time to review your employee communication capabilities and processes just to determine which tools and channels you currently have access to leverage and which are most appropriate and reliable during a violent incident. Then you have to decide the timing, the communication channels, and specific messaging that you're going to use to prevent or minimize any hesitation or confusion during what are really high intensity events. And then we also talked about this a little bit on the threat assessment slide, but there are some common communication and responses to workplace violence incidents that you can templatize in advance. And that can be really helpful because in an emergency, time is of the essence. And people aren't usually thinking too clearly during such incidents like this. So you got to make it easy for them. They just don't have time to think. Now, AlertMedia has created lots of templates for some of these common responses, such as evacuations, shelter in place, and even de-escalation. And you can probably find a whole lot more online as well. Look, every organization faces unique challenges and risks. And I'm certain you'll need to customize these templates that you find to your particular situation, but they're a great start. A lot of people kind of struggle with like, well, where do I start with this? And you can get some great examples and then just tweak it for your particular needs. And then lastly, don't ignore the mental health aspects of workplace violence. I know we talked about this a lot before, but these types of situations are very traumatic events. And it's really crucial that those involved get the help they need to process and recover. It's a big part that people don't think about. You successfully navigate through the situation, and then you tend to forget the human element that it's going to stick with people. So even if an employee didn't directly experience the incident, there could be psychological impacts. So always think about the aftermath. Employee assistance programs that offer mental health resources are an excellent start, but I also recommend having trained counselors, social workers, and maybe even other service providers on hand too after those incidents occur. All right. Well, Matt, I'll go ahead and pass it to you for one more example.
Sure. And in regards to mental health, again, most people suffering from mental health issues are law-abiding citizens. We did have a termination case that comes to mind where somebody was being terminated for, rightfully so, non-performance, not meeting the standards, the high standards of a company. But inadvertently on his corporate credit card, it was discovered post-termination that he had charged some knives, rope, duct tape, and a hunting weapon. Now that's concerning, right? That's a termination, and here's your corporate card. So we conducted a surveillance of that person. It turns out those things were, he was a hunting enthusiast. But on top of that, we surveilled him. His wife was taking him to mental health counseling. His kids were in college. He seemed to have a stable life, and he was seeking employment. He did gain some employment. We did monitor the social media, his open source social media, which is a good practice when you're talking about a concerning termination. But we were able to realize that that person was in a good place. They were getting mental health counseling. He was a hunting enthusiast, really trying to get away with purchasing those weapons and whatnot. But really, it's a good story. Employee assistance. It's those people that refuse employee assistance, that have no remorse for their actions. Those are the ones we can really get concerned about.
Oh, such a great point, Matt. Thank you. Well, I want to take a moment to do our last poll here because I want to get to some audience questions. And then, of course, we have some additional resources for all of you. So let's go ahead and launch that one now. If you would like to learn more about how AlertMedia can help you prepare and respond to workplace violence, please let us know. You can say yes, and we will happily get you the information that you need, or you can say, no, not at this time, and no worries, you know kind of where to find us if you need us. So I'm going to give that one a few more seconds. We don't need to share those results because I'm going to go straight into our questions next. All right, here we go. Thank you guys for your participation on this one. All right. Matt, I'm going to start with you. Is there a list of behavioral cues that can alert the organization before there's an incident?
Absolutely. There are several cues. We find that most people that committed acts of workplace violence in the workplace exhibited life stressors, for instance, well reported. We have a close relationship with the FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico. So there are a list, and it's really, it runs the gamut, that list, but it's frequency and intensity. I'll give you one example. Somebody that's gregarious and very outgoing, and all of a sudden they become withdrawn, introverted, something's going on that might need to take a deeper look. And I always caution people, somebody that's naturally introverted is not a violation of company policy. We're talking about frequency and intensity of changing your behaviors. And it runs the gamut. Being disheveled, appears to be living in the car, hiding bruises with excessive makeup. Those types of things are warning signs with frequency and intensity. We're not talking about somebody that arrives in work on a Monday morning, perhaps looking a little disheveled. I've been there when I was younger, but we're talking about frequency and intensity of grooming, disheveledness, all those types of things appears to be under a lot of stress.
Thank you so much. That makes a lot of sense. Peter, someone would like clarification on something you said earlier. You mentioned that different workplace groups might have different response plans, like back office, warehouse, and others. Can you be a little more specific there on like why they would have different sorts of training? Is it like that customer interface that you were talking about, or can you shed some more light on that?
Yeah, that's it. There could be certain roles that are very different, but they have very similar response plans, but they're always going to be just slightly different based on it could be the physical presence or the physical location around them. You have people in an office that have a lot of different doors they can hide behind and things like that versus someone who's in an open warehouse where there is nowhere to hide. So there are these slight differences you have to think about. Or it could be the example we gave of someone who's dealing with a lot of customers and clients face to face all day long that become aggravated. They're going to have to be trained with certain additional techniques that you could maybe use to de-escalate the situation, whereas someone else may not have to deal with de-escalation. So that's the idea. It's just think, what type of aggressor might this person be confronted with? What are their physical surroundings like? What do they have that they can use to defend themselves, either verbally or physically, or protect themselves, and then try to put together plans for people individually based on those types of roles and physical surroundings.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification. That makes sense. Now I want to share a story that Tanner has shared with us, and it ends in a question. He has been in security for 10 years and can say that it is incredibly valuable to report behaviors early. We prevented an active violence issue because an employee reported that their significant other, who was also an employee, had broken up, and he said some concerning things. So I am curious, how do you educate effectively without venturing into a place where you're also causing increased fear and stress about an incident happening?
I'll take a stab at that.
Yeah, thanks.
First of all, managers should not try to play marriage counselors or relationship counselors to get them back together again. That's a bad idea. That's not what a company is there for. There are warning signs of those behaviors. And I'll tell you, when we train threat management teams, we do scenario-based training, sometimes using live actors. And I have yet to come across one of our clients in 15 years that didn't want a domestic violence scenario. So how do you separate those two? How do you manage those situations? And there could be child custody issues involved that could escalate the situation. All those things have to be managed. Not only the managers trained on de-escalation and conflict resolution, but once it goes over to that threat management team, what are we going to do now? Should we liaison with local law enforcement? Are there incidents at the home we don't know about with police? Those types of things. So really kudos to recognizing those early warning signs and really to stress to victims that it's got nothing to do with your professional performance. As a matter of fact, it's illegal to impact your professional performance or advancement.
Makes sense. All right, Peter, I'm going to go to you. You referenced some communication channels being better than others to use in an active workplace violence. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, certainly. The answer really can be different based on the workplace and the situation, as I was alluding to before. Every situation is unique, but it's really important to consider the person that's committing the act and how they might intercept or perceive or respond to any communication that you try to send out. For example, a blaring siren could exacerbate the situation, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it deters them. If a bunch of mobile phones start to ring or text messages start to chime, it could give away their location if they're in hiding in secret. That's not good either. Oftentimes a message that just pops up silently on computer screens could be a better option. Maybe not everyone's going to see it, but enough people will, and then they can flag down others. So just think about your environment and how what I've mentioned might impact your choice. I know it's not easy and there is no perfect answer, but these are the things you got to think about.
Yeah, we had another comment about that too. What type of site-wide alert is recommended if workplace violence breaks out and you need to notify everyone? So I think you sort of answered both of those questions at once.
Okay, great.
Very good. All right, Matt, what guidance would you give to an organization with community-based employees? For example, home healthcare or social service workers that go into people's homes?
Great question. And we see that more, not only with that type of profession, but hybrid work environments or field workers, teaching them de-escalation techniques and conflict resolution, security awareness issues for that, and who do you report back to? And I think all of us would agree our most important asset in a company is our people. And so when they're trained on these warning signs and security awareness issues, no matter how valuable the company's client is, nothing should jeopardize a person with those. So again, de-escalation, conflict resolution, warning signs training, and last but certainly not least, security awareness, so you don't get trapped in there in the first place.
Very good. Let's talk about this one because I think this is really interesting. And Matt, if this is not in your wheelhouse, just let us know. But when you're creating a plan such as run, hide, fight, what is the liability of asking an employee to be a part of this? Is it like asking them to be a team lead or helping other folks hide? Like, what if they don't want to be involved?
Well, it's interesting you say that about that specific example. They can decline on it, but run, hide, fight is really has been embraced by law enforcement and companies, but it's really about security awareness. It could be quite intimidating to somebody receiving that training if there's an emphasis. Some companies are out there teaching defensive techniques. I'm fine with that, but really it's more important for security awareness. Each of us, Katie, Peter, and I are going to react differently to certain types of situations, just on our makeup, our emotional, psychological, and physical makeup. So identifying stairways in advance. Most people that did suffer tragic consequences didn't know when to run. For instance, when shots are fired, people confuse them for balloons or fireworks and didn't react. People that are reluctant to run, people that are too afraid to leave, and other employees have tried to stop and help them out, and they suffered tragic consequences. What to expect when the police arrive on the scene so that you don't make furtive movements towards police. It's all about training and security awareness. Really, the ones that have been saved, that have made quick decisions, had security awareness in advance. I'll look around my office here. If something bad happened, where would I go? How would I hide? Just instill that in your memory. You're not supposed to live in a state of fear for this active shooter phenomenon. What you do need is to act in a state of awareness. Those of us that are still going to movies now, I bet you 10 years ago, you didn't take note of the exits. We certainly do now. Or when you're shopping at a mall, how would I get out? It's not to be in a constant state of fear. So just that security awareness and the liability issue, it's all about prevention, to take the training. And if it's done in a very mature way with a calming effect, here's what we know about previous incidents, and here's what you can do to think about these issues now so that when it does come, you're making a rational decision in a short amount of time.
Excellent. All right. Let me ask this one. Are employees obligated to let their employer know about a mental health issue? Do you happen to know the answer to that, Matt?
Well, certainly, HIPAA comes into effect. You can't, just open the door and talk about somebody who has mental health diagnoses. We applaud employee assistance programs, and we applaud the fact that should be private information. There are public safety exceptions that the employer has to be aware of. I'll give you an example. Somebody has some mental health issues. They get referred to EAP. Is your EAP program aware of their duty to warn? And what does that mean? Sometimes they'll outsource to a therapist, well-qualified therapists. We applaud those things, divorce, debt consolidation, illness in the family, all those life stressors that could potentially cause an escalation in workforce risk management. But the key is the duty to warn. If they say, oh, I'm going to come back to the office, I could just wring my boss's neck. Well, the therapist is required by law on a public safety exception to go back to the employer and warn them about that. That's when HIPAA public safety exceptions come into play. And it's very important in that threat management team training to address issues such as that. What are the public safety exceptions to sharing information? Too oftentimes people hide behind HIPAA or FERPA in academic institutions, your academic record. They hide behind that saying, we can't share that information because it's private. It's not private if a public safety exception ensues. Very important to have your legal counsel or some type of legal representation on that threat management team. It's a complicated question with a complicated answer I just gave, but there are public safety exceptions to sharing that information, but we just can't allow these domestic violence cases and mental health issues to be talked at the water cooler. It's really important for the success of the program to keep that information private and respect people's privacy.
Excellent. All right. Well, we have time for one more quick question and answer here. A lot of folks are commenting about situational awareness, right? So there's a lot of engagement here. You've mentioned some of it already, Matt. Folks are calling out that that's called situational awareness. But then we have one specific person who would like to know if you think that a situational awareness training would pair well with workplace violence training. And also, do you suggest any other types of training that go well with workplace violence?
Yes, it does pair well. The workforce, the general foundational workforce that we give, when we conduct active assailant training, the very first few minutes, we address behaviors. Look, before this action occurs, and this, couldn't agree more, it's situational awareness. Those can be interactive, situational awareness and security awareness. But to brief and let people know, we think people are remiss in giving active shooter training or active assailant training and let's talk about the behaviors that led to that incident. Let's try to prevent it from happening in the first place. So they should go hand in hand. We're firm believers in prevention training and we're firm believers in active assailant response. Do you know why I say active assailant response? Because many of those incidents are done with handguns or knives. There's a Hollywood myth that it's always a person, maybe a white male with a long gun, wearing a black ninja outfit coming in to be an active shooter, and that's just not the case. It's a variety of genders, it's a variety of demographics with a variety of weapons. So we call it active assailant training as a best practice.
Such a great point. Well, thanks for all the questions, guys. If you didn't get yours answered, we will try to get you those answers after the webinar. And then I'm also going to share some contact information for Peter and Matt in just a moment. But first, I promised you additional resources. So here they are. Peter mentioned earlier that AlertMedia has some templates you can use to develop your workplace violence response plan. You can find those for free at alertmedia.com in the resources section. And then, of course, Sikich has some fantastic workforce management services you'll definitely want to take advantage of. Those are things like workplace violence prevention program support, training, and threat management. You can find all that information and much, much more at sikich.com. So now I would just like to thank Matt and Peter for joining us today and sharing their expertise. Matt, it was so great to have you. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you. It was really an honor and a pleasure.
Wonderful. And Peter, always a pleasure working with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you as well, and appreciate everyone attending.
Thank you.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of you now for attending and spending some time with us this afternoon. We'd love to see you on another AlertMedia webinar, so stay tuned for that. And then, of course, I want to thank EHS Today for being such a wonderful partner, as always.